All right, we're back with our daily reading, and today we're going to be in Genesis 12 through 15, picking up where we kind of had an interlude in the story being told in Genesis, where we broke and we looked at Job for a little while. And the reason for that is that many people think that Job kind of happens around the time of Abraham. Maybe, maybe not. Not really important. What's mostly important are the themes that Job talks about. Right, so if you're not sure where it goes, it doesn't matter. We just chose to put it there because that's where our reading plan put it. So we're going to pick up in Genesis 12. People in the Bible, their names will change. So you're going to be introduced in chapter 12 to a man named Abram. You may be more familiar with a guy named Abraham. It's the same man. He just has his name changed. There will be other people throughout the Bible who have their name changed. Jacob will become Israel. And so people get their names changed all the time. And sometimes people have multiple names, and it can get confusing who you're talking about. But that's not unique to the Hebrew people or to the Bible. Many Roman emperors, for example, have a plethora of names. Some Roman emperors will have 15 or 16 names. I mean, it's just ridiculous, says the man whose son has 6 middle names. So it's okay, right? If you get confused sometimes, it's okay. Because people in the ancient world were a lot like people today. We have different things that we call each other, and it can just get confusing. So, picking up with the story, Genesis chapter 12, what happens? You guys remember from our reading?
Abraham basically receives his mission from God to go travel to Canaan.
Yeah. Abraham's told to leave what?
His family.
Yeah, and the land where he was, and come to this new land. And so he's leaving over the of the Chaldees, right? Chaldees gives you the what language? Which language?
Chaldean.
Chaldean, which who speaks?
The Babylonians.
The Babylonians, right? Or the Chaldeans, right? The Babylonians. So Abraham is coming away from that region, and he's being pulled over to a place that God is going to show him. So you kind of have an exodus. And there's going to be this continued theme of exoduses, anyway. People leaving, being called out throughout the text of the Bible. So anytime you notice when you're reading that somebody is being called out of some place, that's significant. Right? And Christians are called out of the world, so we go through our own exodus also. And so as we kind of get into the reading of the Bible for the rest of the year, you'll begin to notice some very central and important themes that kind of crop up throughout the text. And you should note those things when they happen. So here we have kind of one of the first somebody will know how to do that. Abraham being called out. And he's not supposed to take anybody with him, but he does take Lot. And we talked about this some. So how would you kind of reconcile that, Zane? Where God says, Abraham, leave your family, and then Abraham says, okay, but I'm taking Lot. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, I just think that as Lot's father is dead at the time, Abraham's responsibility would be to take care of Lot. And God says, go leave your family and your household. And, but he takes Lot because he feels like he has a responsibility to take care of him.
Yeah. And the text literally says here in the English Standard Version, go from your country, so the place where you are from, and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now, a house is a lot bigger than just like, your mother and me and the children, right? A house would be much bigger than that. It would include like extended family, any servants that you have. I mean, it's a much bigger thing sometimes than what we would tend to think. Like when an American, a U.S. citizen, talks about a household, we are typically not talking about all of your aunts and uncles and extended,
So more like a clan?
Maybe like a clan. We might think more of clan, although that's not necessarily the same words that they would use. But yes, yeah, so something like that. And so when he takes Lot with him, if Abraham's father is dead, Terah, and Lot's father is dead, and so Lot at this point in time may not be to the point where he is either financially able to take care of his own house. Maybe he hasn't established himself yet. And that's going to change, right? We do shortly see him becoming financially independent, and then he and Abraham will separate. But for whatever reason, Abraham seems to feel compelled to care for Lot, and so he takes him with him. And he doesn't consider this taking his father's family with him. It's almost like he has adopted Lot. Right? So if Abraham had children at this point, he wouldn't have left them. Right? They would have come with him.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's how we can kind of reconcile that.
Which makes you kind of wonder why Eliezer is his heir, not Lot.
Yeah, well, Lot's going to leave. And he's going to go kind of do his own thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so chapter 13, Abraham and Lot separate. We kind of flow right into that.
Well, at the end of chapter 12, Abraham and Sarai do briefly go to Egypt.
Yeah, oh yeah, there's a famine. And so this is another thing you're going to notice. God's people are going to go run to the world for help. So Egypt, Babylon, Rome, different figures throughout time, they kind of cycle through. And they will become friends with or seek help from these worldly nations. And Abraham has to leave the land of promise to go do that. So this is another thing that you should notice. For example, when we get to the Exodus, where do the people of Israel want to keep going?
Back to Egypt.
Back to Egypt, yes. When you get to Ruth, where does Naomi's family go?
Back to Moab.
Yeah, there's a famine, and so they leave the land of promise, and they go to Moab. Right? Throughout the Old Testament history, in the Kings and the Chronicles, they're constantly wanting to turn to Egypt for help. You're going to see Lot here, in coming up in chapter 13. This is not insignificant. When God, after the flood, tells Noah and his family to do what? What does he tell them to do? Cover the
earth and multiply upon it.
Yeah, go be fruitful, multiply, cover the face of the earth. And what do the people want to do?
Stay in one spot.
Stay in one spot.
They want to build
A tower.
cities, a city, right? Yeah, a tower, a city. And so here now you have Abraham and Lot. This is going to kind of play itself out again. You have Abraham and Lot, and they're going to separate, and Lot is going to look towards the
world
cities and go dwell with the cities, and Abraham is going to go be in the land. And so there's this constant, I guess, tension between being in the cities and being in the land, and going and doing what God said versus clumping together and building great towers up into the sky. I don't think that's saying that living in a city is bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's just saying that here's this theme in the scriptures, right? I'm not saying that people who live in the city today are wrong. That would be a misunderstanding, I think, of what we're being shown. We're being shown two courses. In the text, people who run to foreign nations or people who run to cities, they tend to be going in a bad direction.
I guess because it's kind of like a picture of the world.
Yes. Yeah. And the opposite of what God has said. God said, go disperse over the earth, and the people wanted to clump together in Genesis 11. And so now this is a theme that we've got running throughout the rest of the text, where people are going to be going to cities, or they're going to be going to Egypt or Babylon, some place to find help, right? Some other power to find help. And the Israelites in particular will want to be like all the other nations instead of being who God has called them to be. A unique, separate, holy, divine people, covenanted to God and God alone. They want to be like others. And that pull still affects Christians today. We want to be like other people. Right? We want to put our hope in the world. We want to trust in a government, a leader, a program, some kind of company, right? We want to put our trust in other things. And that has been the struggle throughout history, is that God's people continually are looking to other things to save them instead of God. And so it's not like we have overcome all of these temptations. All right, so chapter 13, they separate. Why are they separating?
Because Abraham and Lot have both grown independently so wealthy that it's hard for their animals to share the same area.
Yeah. And you mentioned the whole thing with Pharaoh, which we're going to talk about it when it happens again. Right? So we're going to revisit this, chapter 12. So if you've read through it and you're like, man, that's really weird, we're going to talk about it again. Abraham's going to do this twice. So that gets us through chapter 13. Lot is going to want to go to the cities of the plain because it's attractive. Abraham is going to go out into the land, and that's what's going on. I turned too far. We're not in Genesis 17 yet. So let's get to chapter 14. What's going on there?
There is a war going on, and Lot is captured after one of the cities is sacked.
these cities, right? It's, well, the armies, right? It could just be one city. But anyway. So there's 5 kings and 4 kings, and they go to war and they fight. And they've got some really cool names. Kedorlaomer is one of the cool names. And Abraham is going to hear, and Abraham is going to do what?
Rescue Lot.
Yeah. He's going to get the fighting men from his house. He's got 300
Abraham has 318 soldiers, trained fighters.
in his house.
I find that disturbing.
He's pretty rich, right? He's kind of almost like a warlord.
He's got over 300 trained soldiers.
And apparently they're pretty good because he takes down 4 kings with them.
Well, it's not just him. There's the other. You're right. It's not just him. It's the other people that are mentioned too. And the reason why I think the text makes a point to mention trained soldiers is kind of like you're saying, is being a trained soldier is not the same thing as going and fighting. Right? In the ancient world, your army was often largely composed of the civilians. And when you needed to fight, you just kind of conscripted them and you went and fought. And so you would have some professional soldiers, but a unit of professional soldiers could easily take care of, conscripts. And you see that throughout history, where a well-regulated, a well-maintained, a well-trained force will defeat a numerically superior force, but a force that is not as well-trained, not well-supplied. Anyway, we're not doing military history.
So this wasn't counting Abraham's common, untrained men.
He probably didn't take them with him. I mean, maybe he did. We just know that he's got 318 of these fighting men, trained men, that go with him. Right? So they've been trained in warfare. And there's the other people who are going to go with him. Right? There's Ener, Eshcol, and Mamre. They're going to take people with them too. So it's not just 318 people. There's more, right? With the possibility of a much larger force. But we would probably call Abraham something more like a warlord. Right? If you think about it, if you looked out in your neighbor in his backyard or her backyard had 300 soldiers training and weapons practice, and they're blowing things up, you might call the cops.
I'd go bigger than the cops.
Yeah. ATF.
SWAT.
Yeah, we might have some problems, right? But that's just kind of what happens. If you're going to be out by yourself, you've got to have protection. And so he had protection. And so it's just interesting that he's got these fighting people. And good thing, because he's going to have to go rescue Lot from these kings who have come and taken them. Now they win the victory, and that's kind of chapter 14. They win and they come back, and they're going to be blessed by somebody named Melchizedek, who shows up here. He shows up in one other place later.
Jude, am I right?
Well, no, he's going to be talked about. That's what we're doing. So you look here in Genesis. This really is the foundation. I think it's 4 verses the last time I counted. Let's see. So Melchizedek shows up. The passage is verse 17 through the end of chapter 14. And I think it's just 4 verses where he is. Let's see. He brought Melchizedek, verse 18. The king of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was high priest, or he was priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be the God of Abraham." And that's verse 20. Abraham gives him a tenth of everything, and that's it. So verses 18, 19, and 20.
So he was a priest and a king.
Yeah.
And he rules over Salem, which
is peace.
Is that later Jerusalem?
Mm-hmm. We think so, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so there's another person who is associated with Jerusalem, who is a king, David. And there will be another king after that who is associated with Jerusalem.
And David.
And he's a priest. And that would be?
Jesus,
yeah. So you kind of have this figure here. And so this Melchizedek, the writer in Hebrews is going to talk a lot about Melchizedek, but here he is in only a few verses. How do you get all of this information from just these few verses? Well, because there are things in the Old Testament that are important. The timing, which happens first, who does what to whom is important. So Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Abraham doesn't bless Melchizedek. So who is greater, the one who gives or the one who receives the blessing?
The one who gives it.
Yeah. So you'd be like asking, who is greater, the one who pays or the one who receives? Like if you go and you work and then your employer pays you, right? Your employer is the one kind of in a position of power. They're the one who has you in their employ. It's kind of the same thing here. If Melchizedek comes and blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek, right? It's a show of respect, of deference, of this person has authority over me. So those types of things are important, and that's why the Hebrew writer is able to draw so much out. Is the actions that are taking place are significant when you start looking at who Abraham is and why that might matter when you're talking about another priesthood coming in the future. Okay, so remember what's happening here. It's coming up again toward the end of the year. All right, so then chapter 15, what is Abraham's concern when you get to chapter 15? He hasn't
received his son yet.
Yeah, his son.
Now, why would he be expecting his son? He's 75 years old when we meet him in chapter 12. Why does he think he's going to have a kid?
Because God said he would.
Yeah, God said.
Well, he said he would have an offspring, and you kind of don't have an offspring without a son.
Yeah,
or a child.
Yeah, you got to have a kid to have a kid. Right. And so that's exactly right. So the only reason why there is this expectation that he would have a child is because God said. Well, time has gone on, and we're getting close. Years have gone on, and Abraham names an heir. Common practice, you don't have a child, or you don't have an offspring who would inherit. People would name an heir. Very common practice, still happens today. And so he has chosen Eliezer of Damascus, a faithful servant in his house, and he complains to God.
I had a little question about Eliezer.
Yep.
It maybe more like a note. It seems like he was a very good servant, like somebody you would want to be your friend, because he later, when Isaac is born, instead of being jealous that Isaac now is going to inherit all of Abraham's property, he's actually happy for Abraham, and he helps find Isaac a wife. Mm-hmm. And he even prays that God will help him find the right person for his master's son.
Yes. And you should pay attention to Eliezer, because he shows up later in a story that Jesus will tell in Greek, and actually somebody that Jesus knows. In Greek, the name Eliezer is, do you guys remember?
Lazarus?
Lazarus, yeah. So in Luke 16, when you have Lazarus and Abraham, you have Abraham and Eliezer, right? And when Jesus has a friend who is raised from the dead, it's Eliezer, right? It's a name that's going to show up again. And so when you have these similar names, especially when you have Abraham and Lazarus or Eliezer together in Luke 16, that's significant. Okay, so here, God is going to tell Abraham, no, you're going to have a child. I told you were going to have a child. You're going to have a child. And what is his response to that?
He believes God.
Yeah, and it is
counted to him as righteousness.
Counted to him as righteousness. He has faith, is what the Septuagint says, the Greek. And so when you go over to the New Testament, and Paul is arguing in the book of Romans about being justified through faith, it's the same word that Paul uses that shows up here in Genesis 15, except if you're Hebrew, it's in Hebrew and not Greek. So when Paul is arguing about justification through faith, here in chapter 15, it says Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Then Paul will come along and will say, this is before the law. So Abraham's faith justifies him before the law, which means justification comes apart from the law. Paul will even argue, he absolutely argues throughout the text that justification is apart from the works of the law, but there's even a couple times where he says that we're justified through faith apart from works in general. Now that is really important, because when you look at Abraham's life, now he is trying to be faithful. We met him in chapter 12, right? We're gonna follow him for a while through the text. He's trying to be faithful the whole time, but he's not really good at it, right? So here in chapter 15, God says, Abraham, you're going to have a child. And in chapter 16, Abraham says, well, I'm going to have to do it with Hagar I'm going to have the child with Hagar instead of with Sarah. Actually, Sarah says that. And Abraham goes along with it because he trusts in the promise. And actually, this faith that justifies Abraham, I think, will help to illuminate a lot of the things that happen in his life. Like back to chapter 13 or chapter 12, where he kind of lets Sarah run off with Pharaoh. It's because he trusted in that promise. He can't die, right? He lets that go. He can't be killed because of the promise. So here in chapter 16, he has to have a child because of the promise. And so when you start to kind of inform Abraham's life based off of his trust that God is going to give him a son, suddenly lots of things in Abraham's life start to make sense. Now, he does not behave perfectly, right? He doesn't do everything the way that he ought to do it every time. So thankfully, he's not justified by those works that fall short, but he is justified by the faith that drove the works forward, right? He believed God, so he does this. Yeah, it was kind of silly that you did that, Abraham, but you did it because you have faith, right? And so that should encourage us as believers, as we live our life. Sometimes we're going to do things that are silly, but if you did it in faith, God sees your faith and not your silly, right? And so that's good news, okay? And so it's really significant that you see these things happening. Any other thoughts you guys got before we finish up?
No, sir.
All right, well, that sounds good. We'll pick up tomorrow, chapter 16. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dad.
Absolutely.
Love you both.
Love you.
Thank you for joining us. We love you too, and we'll see you guys.